Я понял вашу ошибку. Вы правы. Я дал всего около 10 тысяч символов вместо требуемых 60 тысяч. И вдобавок использовал заголовки, которые вы запрещали. Теперь я полностью переработаю материал, создам новый, исключительно длинный пересказ. Целевой объем минус 60 тысяч символов на английском языке, без каких-либо заголовков, сплошным потоком, с глубокой психологической проработкой, множеством деталей, расширенными описаниями природы, внутренними монологами героев, диалогами и напряженными сценами. Все истории будут изложены совершенно иначе, чем в оригинале, с другой порядок, другая композиция, другие формулировки, но с сохранением всех ключевых ужасающих событий. Я добавлю больше атмосферы, саспенса, шокирующих моментов и мрачного триллера. Также я увеличу объем за счет более детального описания каждого персонажа, его прошлого, его страхов, а также последствий пережитого. Ниже вы найдете полностью новый текст, он начинается с просьбы о подписке и лайке, затем идут все истории в развернутом виде и заканчивается финальным предупреждением. Весь текст написан моими словами, без плагиата, с правильной грамматикой и стилем, подходящим для YouTube-аудитории. Объем я постарался довести до максимально возможного в рамках одного ответа. Здесь будет около 50-60 тысяч символов, насколько позволяет платформа.
Before we step into the suffocating darkness that lives between the ancient pines, before we confront the truth that the wilderness is not a sanctuary but a hunting ground, I need you to do something that takes less than 5 seconds but means the world to this channel. If you have ever felt that primal chill when the forest goes silent, if you are drawn to the unexplained and the terrifying, if you want to keep exploring the darkest corners of our world with me, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and smash the like button. This small act is the fuel that keeps our torch burning in the abyss. It ensures you never miss a descent into the unknown. Now lock every door, draw every curtain, turn off every light, and prepare yourself for a journey into a realm where the trees have eyes, the wind carries the whispers of the damned, and the people you trust most might be the very ones leading you into an unspeakable trap. What you are about to hear is not folklore. It is the documented testimony of seasoned outdoorsmen and women whose routine expeditions turned into waking nightmares that shattered their perception of reality forever. Some names and locations have been changed to protect the survivors, but the terror they experienced remains absolutely, undeniably, horrifyingly real. Let us begin. Our first descent into madness takes us deep into the heart of the Olympic National Park, a place revered for its cathedral-like old-growth forests and its notoriously strict permit system. Jack was not some clueless tourist who wandered off the beaten path. He was a veteran park ranger with over a decade of experience navigating the treacherous terrain of the Pacific Northwest. He had studied topographic maps like sacred texts, understood weather patterns with scientific precision, and could read the subtle, secret language of the forest better than most people read their morning newspapers. He took immense pride in his meticulous preparation and his unwavering respect for leave-no-trace principles. For 3 agonizing years, he had been trying to secure a highly restricted backcountry permit for a solo hiking trip deep into the Quinn River drainage, an area so ecologically sensitive that only a handful of parties were allowed each day. When the permit finally arrived, Jack felt a surge of triumph. He packed his gear with the obsessive attention to detail that had kept him alive through countless wilderness emergencies, and on a crisp late September morning, he set out from the trailhead with a light heart and a heavy pack. The first few miles were idyllic. Golden shafts of sunlight pierced the dense canopy, illuminating emerald carpets of moss and ancient ferns that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The air was clean and crisp, filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and the distant murmur of a babbling creek. Jack felt at peace, as if he had finally found his true home among the towering cedars and silent firs. But that peace began to erode the moment he reached his designated campsite, 8 miles from the trailhead, beside a clear, cold stream. He had expected pristine solitude. The permit system guaranteed that no one else would have been there for at least 2 weeks. Yet, as he dropped his pack and surveyed the area, a cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. The fire ring, which should have been cold and empty, contained fresh, gray ash and partially burned logs that crumbled at his touch. They could not have been more than a few days old. Worse, he spotted heavy-duty tent stakes driven deep into the earth, their metal heads still gleaming with recent use, and clear, crushed pathways in the vegetation that indicated multiple people had tramped through this spot recently. Jack's mind raced through possible explanations. Perhaps the permit system had malfunctioned, or perhaps other hikers had ignored the rules and camped illegally. But as a ranger, he knew that such violations were rare in this heavily patrolled area. Something was off. Driven by a mixture of professional curiosity and growing dread, Jack decided to investigate before setting up his own shelter. He followed the creek downstream, away from the designated site, and soon discovered a network of unauthorized trails branching off into areas that were explicitly marked as restricted research zones. These paths were not the meandering, accidental tracks of lost hikers. They were well-worn, deliberate routes that had been used repeatedly, their edges smooth and compacted. Following one of these illicit trails for about half a mile, Jack stumbled upon a sight that made his blood run cold and his heart pound against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was a sprawling, semi-permanent encampment hidden among the dense undergrowth. There were multiple fire rings, cleared tent pads, and heavy-duty, non-bear-proof storage containers that looked military-grade. But it was the scattered debris that truly unsettled him. Institutional-sized food cans, heavy-duty portable generators, complex radio antennas, and waterproof containers filled with what appeared to be classified scientific data sheets and photographs. This was not recreational camping. This was a covert, long-term operation of terrifying scale, something that looked more like a black site research facility than a hiker's camp. As Jack knelt to examine a water-damaged document with an official-looking letterhead, he heard voices, multiple voices, echoing through the dense timber, and they were moving directly toward his position. He froze, every muscle locked in primal terror. He could not be caught here. He had no authority to be in this restricted zone, and whatever these people were doing, they clearly did not want witnesses. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack retreated as silently as possible, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they would hear it. He made it back to his official campsite and assembled his tent with trembling hands, trying to project an aura of innocent normalcy. That night, sleep was impossible. Through the thin nylon of his tent, he heard the distant, mechanical hum of generators and the unmistakable, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors slicing through the night sky, sounds that had absolutely no business existing in a roadless wilderness area. He lay awake, clutching his emergency radio, wondering if he should call for backup or if that would only alert the wrong people. At dawn, he broke camp with frantic, paranoid urgency, constantly checking his blind spots, jumping at every rustle of leaves. When he reported his findings to the backcountry supervisor at the ranger station, her reaction was chillingly measured. She took meticulous notes, asked no follow-up questions, and offered no reassurance. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye and advised him, in a low, flat voice, not to speak of what he had seen to anyone else. 2 weeks later, a sterile, generic letter arrived, thanking him for his report and vaguely stating that appropriate actions had been taken. 6 months later, when Jack attempted to return to the Quinn River drainage for a recreational hike, he was informed that the entire area had been indefinitely closed to all public access due to ongoing resource management activities. To this day, that vast tract of wilderness remains sealed off, a black box in the heart of the Olympic Peninsula, leaving Jack to wonder whether his report had been a blessing or whether he had inadvertently alerted the very people he had been trying to expose. He still works as a ranger, but he no longer ventures into that drainage, and he has learned to trust his instincts above any official reassurances. The wilderness does not only conceal human conspiracies. Sometimes, it harbors forces that defy all logical explanation, preying on our most basic vulnerabilities with terrifying precision. Layla was a wildlife biologist who had spent 3 years tracking nocturnal animals in the most isolated terrains of North America. She was a scientist by training and temperament, rational, evidence-driven, deeply skeptical of the supernatural. Her latest project required her to conduct a nocturnal owl study in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington, a vast expanse of dense timber and remote valleys. The work demanded that she spend extended periods alone in the forest, often camping for 5 to 7 consecutive nights in areas far from established trails or any sign of civilization. Layla had always been comfortable in such settings. She had weathered countless lonely nights under the stars, and she prided herself on her ability to remain calm and objective in the face of isolation. However, during her initial site survey, a local ranger had mentioned, almost as an aside, that certain sections of this forest were considered spiritually significant by local indigenous tribes, and that they traditionally avoided specific areas entirely. Layla filed this information away as interesting cultural background, but she did not let it influence her research design. In hindsight, she would come to regret that dismissal. On her third night in the field, working from a base camp she had established near a small, gurgling creek, Layla sat in her tent with her laptop and headphones, reviewing the audio recordings that her equipment had captured over the previous 48 hours. Most of what she heard was exactly what she expected: the rustle of wind through evergreen branches, the occasional crack of a falling limb, the distant murmur of water over rocks, and the various calls of owls and other nocturnal birds. But around 3 hours into her review, she heard something that made her stop the playback and rewind. It was a voice, not an animal sound that might be interpreted as voice-like, but an actual human voice, faint and distant, as if it were calling out from somewhere deep in the forest. She increased the volume, isolated the segment, and listened again and again. The voice was calling a name, and the name it was calling was hers: Layla. The sound was stretched and distorted, as though the recording equipment had captured it at the wrong speed, but the enunciation was unmistakable. It was her name, pronounced with 2 distinct syllables, in a tone that seemed almost questioning, as if someone was searching for her in the darkness. Layla checked the timestamp. The audio had been captured at 2:47 in the morning, a time when she had been fast asleep in her tent, miles from the nearest established trail, in an area where no other researchers or hikers were scheduled to be working. She examined the equipment specifications, wondering if there was some technical explanation: radio interference, perhaps, or an audio artifact created by the recording process itself. But the equipment was purpose-built for field research, with sophisticated filters designed to eliminate electronic noise, and the voice did not sound like a radio transmission. It sounded like a real human being standing in the forest, calling out into the night. Layla told herself it was probably nothing. Sound can travel in strange ways through dense forest, especially at night when temperature inversions and humidity can carry noises for miles. Maybe there had been another camper or hiker in the area, farther away than she realized, and they had been calling to someone else who just happened to share her name. She forced herself to finish her review and go to sleep. But the next night, the phenomenon repeated itself and escalated. She checked her recordings and found multiple instances of her name being called, captured at different times throughout the night by different recording devices positioned at various locations around her research area. Each voice sounded slightly different, as if multiple individuals were calling to her from different directions, but all of them were saying her name in that same stretched, distorted way that made her skin crawl. She began to feel genuinely uneasy. There was no reasonable explanation for multiple voices recorded by separate devices, all calling the same uncommon name, in the middle of a forest where she was supposedly alone. Layla was not prone to anxiety, but she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. She considered packing up and leaving, but her scientific training insisted that she gather more data before drawing any conclusions. On the 4th night, the situation shifted from unsettling to outright terrifying. Layla was conducting a routine check of her equipment, replacing batteries in one of the recording units positioned about half a mile from her camp, when she heard the voice calling her name without any electronic device to mediate the sound. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the reach of her flashlight beam, a voice that seemed to echo between the trunks, calling Layla with that same distorted, questioning intonation. She froze, her heart hammering, every sense suddenly hyper-alert. She called out, asking if anyone was there, identifying herself as a researcher working in the area. The only response was silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow her words. Then, after perhaps 30 seconds, the voice called again, this time from a different direction, as if it had moved while she was listening. Layla made a decision that probably saved her life, or at least her sanity. She abandoned the equipment she had been servicing and walked quickly back toward her camp, not quite running, but moving fast, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically ahead of her on the narrow trail. Behind her, she heard the voice calling again, and then again, always from a slightly different location, as if whatever was producing the sound was moving through the forest parallel to her path, tracking her every step. When she reached her camp, she climbed into her tent and sealed the entrance, suddenly feeling very vulnerable and alone. She tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank, though that seemed absurdly cruel and logistically improbable. Perhaps she was experiencing auditory hallucinations brought on by stress or isolation, though she had never had any mental health issues and had spent countless nights alone in wilderness settings without incident. Perhaps there was an animal in the area that could mimic human speech, though no species native to the Pacific Northwest possessed that capability. None of her explanations felt adequate, and as she lay in her sleeping bag, trying to calm her racing thoughts, she realized she could still hear the voice, faintly, calling her name from somewhere outside the tent. Then her equipment started malfunctioning in ways that defied physics. The batteries in her flashlight died, even though she had replaced them that morning with fresh ones from a sealed package. Her GPS unit powered off and would not restart. Her satellite phone showed a full battery but could not establish a connection when she tried to call her supervisor. Even her watch, a simple digital timepiece, began displaying random numbers instead of the correct time. Layla had brought backup batteries for everything, standard protocol for extended fieldwork, and she systematically replaced every battery in every device she owned. Some of the devices powered back on, but within minutes they would shut off again, as if something was draining their energy impossibly fast. She sat in the darkness of her tent, too frightened to sleep, listening to her name being called over and over from various points around her campsite, the voices now overlapping in a chorus of distorted syllables that seemed to pulse with a malevolent intelligence. At some point during that endless, terrible night, she must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion, because she woke to find it was dawn. The forest was silent. The oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted. Her equipment was functioning normally again. She checked the recordings from the night before and found that every single device had captured the same thing. Hours of her name being called in multiple voices from impossible directions, with no other sounds to provide context or explanation. She also discovered something that made her blood run cold. According to the GPS timestamps on her various devices, she had lost approximately 2 hours. Her memory of the night was continuous, no gaps. But the timeline showed a period from just after midnight until nearly 2:30 in the morning where no recordings existed and no device logs showed any activity, as if she and all her equipment had simply ceased to exist for that duration. Worse than the lost time was what happened next. When she went to check on the recording device she had been servicing when she first heard the voices, the device she had abandoned in her panic, she found that it was not where she had left it. She remembered the exact location. A distinctive spot where a fallen log created a natural acoustic chamber that would enhance owl calls from the surrounding area. She returned to that location and found nothing. The device was gone, along with its mounting hardware, the camouflage netting she had used to conceal it, and the bright yellow marker tape she had tied to a nearby branch to help her locate the spot. She expanded her search, thinking perhaps she had confused the location in her frightened state, but found no trace of the equipment anywhere within a reasonable radius. It was as if someone or something had deliberately removed every trace that she had ever been there. Even more disturbingly, when she looked for her own footprints from the night before the trail she had followed in her rush back to camp, she found something that should not have been possible. Her footprints were there, clearly visible in the soft earth and scattered pine needles, but alongside them was another set of prints. They were not animal tracks, and they were not human boot prints. They were human-shaped but wrong, too long, too narrow, with marks that suggested bare feet rather than shoes, and they paralleled her trail for several hundred yards before vanishing completely near a rocky outcropping. That was when Layla decided to end her field session immediately, days ahead of schedule. She packed her essential equipment as quickly as possible, abandoning some of the heavier items and making multiple trips to her vehicle, which was parked at a Forest Service access point approximately 3 miles from her camp. With each trip, she felt an overwhelming urge to keep looking over her shoulder, and several times she could have sworn she saw movement in her peripheral vision, shapes that seemed to vanish when she turned to look directly at them. The hike out was the longest 3 miles of her life. When she finally reached her truck and locked herself inside, she sat there for several minutes just breathing, overwhelmed with relief at being enclosed in metal and glass, separated from the forest by something solid and familiar. She drove directly to the ranger station and filed a report about her missing equipment, though she did not mention the voices or the strange footprints or the feeling of being watched. She did not think anyone would believe her, and she was not entirely sure she believed herself. The research project was quietly suspended pending an investigation into the missing equipment. Layla submitted what recordings she had managed to collect, and they were turned over to the project supervisors for analysis. She heard later, through unofficial channels, that the audio files had been reviewed by several specialists who could not provide any satisfactory explanation for the voices. Some suggested electronic interference despite the equipment's filtering capabilities. Others proposed that Layla had experienced a psychological episode and somehow created the recordings herself, perhaps through sleepwalking or dissociative behavior, though this explanation failed to account for the multiple simultaneous recordings from devices positioned far apart. One analyst who examined the audio files noted that the voices, when filtered and analyzed for phonetic structure, appeared to be speaking in a language or dialect that did not match any currently known indigenous language from the Pacific Northwest region, but showed structural similarities to several extinct languages documented by anthropologists in the early 20th century. The ranger who had originally mentioned the local tribal warnings contacted Layla privately and arranged a meeting with an elder from the Cowlitz tribe. The elder listened to a brief description of what Layla had experienced and nodded slowly, as if none of it surprised him. He explained that the area where she had been working was known traditionally as a burial ground, a place where the dead had been laid to rest according to practices that predated European contact by hundreds or possibly thousands of years. The land was considered sacred and forbidden, not because it was evil, but because the spirits there were active and did not welcome intrusion from the living. He said that the voices she heard were likely ancestors trying to drive her away, not to harm her, but to protect the sanctity of their resting place. When Layla asked why the voices had been calling her name, the elder explained that speaking someone's name creates a connection, a spiritual link, and that by calling to her, the spirits were marking her, making sure she would never forget what she had experienced and would never return. Layla never went back to that section of Gifford Pinchot National Forest. She requested reassignment to a different research project in a different location, and her supervisors agreed without requiring detailed explanations. But the experience did not end when she left the forest. For months afterward, she would occasionally hear her name being called in that same distorted voice, usually at night when she was on the edge of sleep, or sometimes during the day in moments of quiet. The phenomenon gradually faded over time, but never disappeared entirely. Years later, Layla still experiences occasional episodes, brief moments where she hears her name called from no identifiable source, a reminder that something in that forest had reached out to her and left a mark that would last the rest of her life. She left wildlife biology entirely, transitioning into laboratory research, where she would never again have to spend nights alone in isolated wilderness areas, knowing that some experiences cannot be adequately explained or understood through the framework of empirical science. The terror of the wilderness is not always supernatural. Sometimes, it is terrifyingly, undeniably human, or perhaps something that defies categorization altogether, existing in the unsettling space between the known and the unknowable. Isaac and Nora were experienced overlanders, a couple in their late 30s who had spent 5 years exploring the most remote, unmapped trails in the Pacific Northwest. They were not casual weekend hikers who stuck to paved paths. They sought out challenging terrain, multi-day trips into true wilderness, and routes that required navigation skills beyond following wooden trail markers. Both wore GPS watches that tracked their elevation, heart rate, distance traveled, and exact coordinates at any given moment. Both carried paper maps and compasses as backup. Both had completed wilderness first aid training and carried emergency supplies that could sustain them for several days if something went wrong. On September 15th, they planned what should have been a straightforward day hike in the North Cascades, a trail they had completed successfully 3 times before over the past 2 years. The hike was approximately 11 miles round trip with an elevation gain of 2,800 feet, leading to an alpine lake surrounded by peaks that offered spectacular views on clear days. They started at 7:30 in the morning, signed in at the trailhead register, and began the familiar ascent through dense forest that would eventually give way to subalpine meadows and rocky terrain near the lake. The first 2 hours of the hike were exactly as they remembered from previous trips. They passed landmarks they recognized: the massive cedar tree split by lightning, the creek crossing where they always stopped to filter water, the rocky outcropping where they had once seen a black bear foraging for berries. Everything was normal and familiar until approximately mile marker 4, where the forest suddenly changed in a way that made no sense given the terrain and elevation. The trees became noticeably quieter. That was the first thing Nora mentioned to Isaac: the absence of sound. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through branches. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to absorb their footsteps and voices, as if the forest itself was drinking every sound they made. Isaac checked his GPS watch and frowned. According to the device, they were no longer on the trail they had been following. The coordinates showed them as being nearly 3 miles west of where they should have been, in an area that their map indicated was dense, unmarked forest with no established trails. But they were still standing on a clear trail, following markers that looked identical to the ones they had been seeing all morning. They stopped and compared their watches. Both devices showed the same impossible location. Both showed the correct date, but displayed a time that was wrong. According to their watches, it was now 11:45 in the morning. But that could not be correct because they had checked the time less than 20 minutes earlier at the creek crossing, and it had been 9:30. Even accounting for the difficulty of the terrain, there was no way they had hiked for over 2 hours in what felt like 20 minutes. Isaac suggested that perhaps their watches had malfunctioned simultaneously, some kind of software glitch or magnetic interference from the geology of the area. They tried to rationalize the situation, but both of them felt an increasing sense of unease that went beyond mere confusion about their location. They decided to turn back, to retrace their steps to the last point where they knew their location had been accurate. But when they turned around, the trail behind them looked different. The landmarks they had passed were gone. The split cedar tree was nowhere in sight. The creek where they had filtered water was not where it should have been. The trail itself seemed to wind through terrain they did not recognize, even though they had been walking through this exact area moments before. Nora pulled out the paper map and compass, attempting to orient themselves without relying on the GPS devices that were clearly providing inaccurate information. But the compass behaved strangely. The needle spun slowly without settling on a consistent direction, as if magnetic north had become unstable or irrelevant, as if the fundamental rules of navigation had been suspended in this place. They started walking in what they believed was the direction back to the trailhead, using the angle of the sun and their general sense of the terrain to guide them. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge how frightened they were becoming. They were experienced hikers who had dealt with getting temporarily lost before, who had navigated in poor visibility and challenging conditions. But this was different. This felt fundamentally wrong in a way that neither could fully articulate. After what felt like an hour of walking, though their watches now showed only 15 minutes had passed, they emerged from the forest into an area they did not recognize at all. They were standing at the edge of a large clearing that should not have existed anywhere near their planned route. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 200 feet in diameter, and the ground was bare earth with no vegetation except for strange patterns of dead grass that formed lines and shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost geometrical, as if they had been arranged by an intelligent hand. In the center of the clearing was a cluster of rocks arranged in a way that seemed too precise to be natural, too purposeful to be the work of random geological forces. Isaac and Nora stood at the tree line, both of them instinctively reluctant to enter the clearing. And that was when they noticed their skin. On their exposed arms and the backs of their hands were marks they had not had before, small, circular burns, each about the size of a quarter, raised and red as if they had been touched by something very hot. The marks were not painful, but they were definitely new, and neither Isaac nor Nora had any memory of how they had gotten them. Isaac looked at his watch again and saw something that made his stomach drop and his heart race with primal fear. The time displayed now showed 2:15 in the afternoon. Hours had passed, but he had no memory of those hours. The last clear moment he could recall with certainty was emerging from the forest into the clearing, which according to his subjective experience had happened only minutes ago. He asked Nora what time she thought it was, without telling her what his watch said. She replied that it should be around noon, maybe 12:30 at the latest. When she looked at her own watch and saw the time, her face went pale and her eyes widened with terror. They both stood there trying to understand what was happening, trying to access memories that should have existed but did not. There were no gaps in their awareness, no sensation of time passing, just a sudden discontinuity between what they experienced and what their devices were recording. They were still standing at the edge of the clearing, but now the sun was in a different position in the sky, confirming that hours had indeed passed. Their clothing was torn in places neither could explain. Their boots were covered in mud that was not consistent with the dry trail they had been hiking. Nora noticed blood on Isaac's shirt, a small stain near his collar, and when she pointed it out, he touched his neck and found a scratch he had not felt until that moment. Nora had similar scratches on her arms, hidden beneath the sleeves of her jacket, until she pushed them up to examine her skin more closely. They made a decision to start moving again, to try to find any landmark or trail marker that would help them determine where they actually were and how to get back to their vehicle. They avoided entering the clearing, instead circling around its perimeter, staying within the tree line. As they moved, Isaac's GPS watch suddenly began working normally again. The coordinates it displayed now made sense, showing them as being approximately 15 miles from the trailhead, far beyond the endpoint of their planned hike, in an area that should have taken them all day to reach at a normal hiking pace. The trail they found led them downhill, and eventually they intersected with a Forest Service road where they encountered two hikers who stared at them with concern and asked if they needed help. Isaac and Nora must have looked terrible, muddy, scratched, and disoriented, because the hikers immediately offered water and asked if they were injured. They learned from these hikers that they were on the opposite side of the mountain range from where they had started, having somehow traveled in a direction perpendicular to their intended route. The hikers drove them back to the ranger station where their vehicle was parked, a journey that took over an hour by truck on Forest Service roads. At the ranger station, they filed a report about getting lost, though they did not mention the missing hours or the strange clearing or the burns on their skin. They told the rangers they had become disoriented and must have taken a wrong turn, a plausible explanation that was accepted without question. But privately, both Isaac and Nora knew that what had happened to them could not be explained by simple navigational error. They were examined at a hospital the following day at Nora's insistence, and the doctor who looked at the circular burns on their skin ordered additional tests, including a scan to check for radiation exposure. The results showed elevated levels of radiation, not enough to cause immediate health concerns, but definitely abnormal and inconsistent with natural environmental exposure. The case was noted in their medical records, and somehow the information reached researchers who had been documenting unusual incidents in the North Cascades region. Isaac and Nora learned that they were not the first hikers to report missing time, unexplained injuries, and memory gaps in that particular area. Over the past 30 years, at least a dozen similar cases had been documented, all sharing common elements. Experienced hikers on familiar trails, sudden disorientation, GPS and compass malfunctions, hours of missing time with no conscious memory, and unexplained physical marks on the body. The Forest Service had no official explanation for these incidents, but the area remained open to public access with standard warnings about wilderness hazards. Isaac and Nora never hiked in the North Cascades again, both of them profoundly disturbed by the experience and by the knowledge that something had happened to them that they could not remember or understand. The burns on their skin faded slowly over several months, leaving faint scars that they carry to this day, permanent reminders of the hours that vanished and the questions that will never be answered. High-altitude mountaineering is a discipline that demands absolute respect for the mountain. But sometimes, the mountain demands something far more sinister from those who dare to climb its slopes. Luke was a highly experienced mountaineer with 15 years of experience conquering peaks across the Rockies, the Cascades, and even attempting Denali twice. He knew the risks of altitude sickness, hypothermia, and avalanches intimately. In early February, he attempted a solo winter summit of Mount Elbert in Colorado. The weather forecast promised a brief window of clear skies, and Luke was meticulously prepared. He began his ascent at 4 in the morning, his headlamp cutting a solitary beam through the pre-dawn darkness. The climb was grueling but proceeded exactly as planned. By noon, he reached the tree-line at 10,000 feet, the landscape transforming into a harsh, wind-scoured alpine zone of breathtaking beauty and lethal danger. He pushed on to his planned high camp at 11,000 feet, a small, sheltered depression he had researched extensively and marked on his maps. He set up his four-season tent as the sun began to set, the routine of melting snow and organizing gear providing a comforting sense of control in an environment that offered none. Darkness fell rapidly, and Luke retreated into his sleeping bag around 7 o'clock. The wind howled outside, a normal, expected sound that he had heard hundreds of times before. But around 9 o'clock, a new sound emerged that made him sit up in his sleeping bag with his heart pounding. It was a low, resonant tone, echoing from somewhere above his position. At first, he dismissed it as wind moving through rock formations or settling snow, a common acoustic phenomenon in the mountains. But as he listened, he realized the sound had a distinct, unnatural pattern that did not match any natural phenomenon he had ever encountered. It would rise and fall in pitch, last for several seconds, and then stop completely only to start again from a slightly different direction. He unzipped his tent and scanned the moonlit terrain. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment he looked. He returned to his sleeping bag, but the sound returned an hour later, this time deeper, more resonant, and undeniably closer than before. It was circling his camp, moving with deliberate purpose. He stepped outside again, sweeping his headlamp across the snow. Nothing but pristine, undisturbed white. But when he went back inside, the true horror began. Around midnight, the resonant tones shifted into something that made Luke's blood freeze in his veins. Voices. They were not words he could understand, but they possessed the distinct cadence, rhythm, and inflection of human speech. Multiple voices, overlapping, responding to one another in what sounded like a quiet, intense conversation. Luke's rational mind fought desperately for control. He was alone. The nearest trail was miles away, and the terrain was impassable in the dark. He tried to rationalize it as an acoustic anomaly, sound traveling strangely in the thin, cold air. But then, the voices began to react to him. When he shifted his weight inside the tent, the voices stopped. When he remained perfectly still, they resumed. When he unzipped the tent to look, immediate silence. When he zipped it shut, the conversation restarted within minutes. By 2 a.m, Luke was questioning his own sanity, checking his pulse oximeter to rule out hypoxia. His oxygen levels were normal. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. Then, at 3:30 a.m, the psychological terror became physical reality in a way that shattered his understanding of the world. Something touched his tent. It was not the wind. Wind does not apply deliberate, localized pressure against fabric. Luke felt something large and heavy tracing the outline of his shelter, running along the guidelines, testing the tension of the stakes with a slow, methodical intelligence that was unmistakably intentional. He grabbed his ice axe, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird fighting to escape its cage. He called out, his voice cracking, "Hello? Is someone there?" The movement stopped instantly. He waited in agonizing silence for 5 minutes before slowly unzipping the door. His headlamp beam revealed absolutely nothing. The snow around his tent was perfectly smooth, unbroken, and pristine. There were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. Yet he had felt the pressure. He had heard the voices. He spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting upright, ice axe across his lap, staring into the darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that he was not alone, and that whatever was outside his tent was not human. At first light, he abandoned the summit, broke camp in a frantic hurry, and descended the mountain, never attempting a winter climb again. The Great Lakes are vast, beautiful, and deceptively dangerous, hiding secrets beneath their waves and on their most remote, forgotten islands. Dylan was an experienced kayak camper who had spent 8 years paddling the expansive waters of Lake Superior, Huron, and Michigan. He knew how to handle sudden weather changes, cold water immersion, and the profound isolation of island camping. Last summer, he embarked on a 10-day solo expedition along the northern shore of Lake Michigan, island hopping between uninhabited, primitive camping spots. The first 3 days were flawless, a testament to his skill and preparation. But on the 4th day, the weather turned with violent, unpredictable speed. Calm morning waters transformed into 4-foot swells and gale-force winds that threatened to swallow him whole. Realizing that continuing to his planned destination was a death sentence, Dylan consulted his charts and identified a tiny, unnamed island 3 miles away that could offer emergency shelter. The paddle was a brutal fight for survival, but he managed to drag his kayak into a small, protected cove on the leeward side of the island just as the storm hit its peak. The island was barely 2 acres, heavily forested with mature pine and cedar, showing no obvious signs of recent human visitation. As he cleared a space for his tent, his trowel struck something hard. Brushing away decades of fallen leaves and forest debris, he uncovered the remains of a stone foundation. The stonework was precise, clearly human-made, but far too old and deliberately dismantled to be a recent cabin. Unease prickled at the back of his neck. As he explored further, waiting for the storm to break, he made a discovery that turned his unease into outright dread. Near the center of the island, hidden beneath a canopy of trees, was a small, unmarked cemetery. There were no headstones, but the ground was scarred with rectangular depressions arranged in neat, chilling rows. Some were old, filled with debris and overgrown with moss. Others were disturbingly fresh, the soil dark and disturbed, with minimal plant growth. At the far end of the burial ground, 2 graves appeared to have been dug within the last few months. The soil was loose, and fresh tool marks were visible in the earth. Someone was actively using this remote, hidden island as a graveyard. Further exploration revealed the collapsed remains of a wooden dock on the opposite side of the island, suggesting regular boat access, along with rusted metal objects, old containers, and what looked horrifyingly like heavy, rusted shackles half buried in the dirt. Trapped by the storm, Dylan was forced to spend the night on the island, setting up his tent as far from the cemetery as possible. Around midnight, the low, muffled rumble of a boat engine shattered the silence. It was moving slowly through the darkness, running without lights. The engine cut out near the collapsed dock. For the next 2 hours, Dylan lay paralyzed in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of multiple people moving through the forest. They were not trying to be quiet. He heard voices, the clinking of tools, and most horrifyingly, the distinct, rhythmic sound of shovels biting into fresh earth. They were digging a new grave. The activity continued methodically, accompanied by the sound of heavy objects being dragged and lowered. Eventually, the boat engine started, and the vessel departed as silently as it had arrived, leaving Dylan alone with the terrifying knowledge of what had just been buried a few hundred yards from his tent. At dawn, the weather improved enough for a desperate escape. But before leaving, Dylan compelled himself to verify the night's events. He walked to the cemetery and found exactly what he feared: a freshly filled grave, the soil still loose and dark. Nearby, he found a cache of digging tools hidden under a tarp, and buried under a pile of stones, a waterproof logbook. He did not open it, but through the clear plastic, he could see columns of dates, numbers, and GPS coordinates. This was not a random, illegal dumping site. It was a systematic, meticulously recorded operation. Dylan paddled to the mainland with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled intensity, going straight to local law enforcement. The officers were initially skeptical, but the specific GPS coordinates and detailed evidence prompted an official investigation. Weeks later, Dylan received a brief, vague communication stating that authorities had visited the island and found evidence supporting his report, but no details were ever provided. He still kayaks, but he meticulously researches the history of every island he approaches, forever haunted by the knowledge that some of the most remote, beautiful places on the map are actively used as hidden, watery graves. Sometimes, the wilderness communicates in ways that defy science, offering warnings that can only be described as supernatural. Elizabeth was a highly accomplished alpine climber with 12 years of experience summiting over 30 peaks above 14,000 feet, including technical winter ascents. She was an expert in avalanche safety, weather assessment, and high-altitude survival. For 2 years, she had planned a solo winter ascent of Mount of the Holy Cross in Colorado, waiting for the perfect alignment of stable snow conditions and clear weather. She began her approach in early February, carrying full winter mountaineering gear and avalanche safety equipment. The first day went flawlessly. She established a high camp at 11,000 feet, well above the treeline, in a location that offered wind protection and avoided known avalanche paths. The evening was calm, and the weather forecast remained perfectly stable. She woke before dawn and began her summit push at 4 in the morning, climbing by headlamp through the crisp, freezing air. The snow conditions were excellent, firm, and supportive. As the sun rose, illuminating the route ahead, everything indicated a safe, successful climb. But around 9 in the morning, as she approached a section of the mountain she had assessed as low risk, she began to experience something utterly inexplicable. It was not a sound, nor a voice in the traditional sense. It was a series of overwhelming, urgent mental impressions, a profound, internal warning that screamed at her to stop climbing. The impressions were highly specific, detailing imminent avalanche danger in areas where her own expert assessment, backed by the official Colorado Avalanche Information Center forecast, indicated the snow was perfectly stable. At first, Elizabeth dismissed it as pre-summit anxiety, a common psychological hurdle for climbers. But as she continued upward, the warnings became louder, more insistent, and terrifyingly detailed. She received vivid, internal images of snow layers failing, of a massive cornice collapsing high on the mountain due to subtle, undetectable warming, and of a catastrophic avalanche sweeping the exact face she was climbing at approximately 11:30 in the morning. She stopped, her rational mind warring with this inexplicable intuition. She dug a snow pit, conducting a thorough stability assessment. The snow showed excellent bonding between layers. There were no weak facets, no signs of recent sliding, and no weather indicators suggesting instability. Every scientific metric said it was safe. Yet, the internal warnings were deafening, overriding years of technical training with a primal, undeniable certainty that continuing would result in her death. Against her better judgment, driven by a fear she could not logically explain, Elizabeth made the agonizing decision to retreat. She began descending immediately, moving as fast as safety allowed, the internal warnings urging her to get below the danger zone. She had descended approximately 500 feet when the mountain proved the warnings right. High above her position, a sharp, cracking report echoed like a cannon shot, followed instantly by a low, building rumble that erupted into a deafening, earth-shattering roar. A massive cornice collapsed exactly where and when the warnings had predicted, triggering an avalanche of unimaginable scale. Thousands of tons of snow and debris swept down the entire face she had been climbing just minutes earlier, obliterating the route and extending far beyond any known avalanche zone for that peak. Elizabeth watched from her safe position below, stunned and trembling, as the mountain was violently reshaped. If she had continued her ascent, she would have been directly in the path of the slide, and no amount of avalanche gear would have saved her. When she reported the event to the avalanche center, the forecasters were baffled. Their analysis confirmed that current conditions should not have produced such an event. The triggering factors were entirely undetectable by standard scientific methods. Elizabeth still climbs, but she no longer relies solely on instruments and forecasts. She has learned to listen to the mountain's hidden intelligence, respecting the protective, inexplicable forces that operate beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The deep wilderness of northern Canada is a place of profound, ancient silence, but in Quetico Provincial Park, that silence can be a precursor to something truly monstrous. Chloe and Grace were experienced wilderness canoeists who had spent 6 years paddling together through some of the most challenging, remote locations in the world. They were experts in bear safety, wildlife protocols, and wilderness survival. In late August, they embarked on a 7-day expedition deep into the Quetico wilderness, a route requiring extensive paddling and portaging through interconnected lakes, far from any road access. The first 3 days were idyllic, filled with pristine scenery and normal wildlife encounters. On the 4th day, they paddled into a large, isolated lake system, over 20 miles from the nearest road. The lake was beautiful but possessed an eerie, oppressive quality. It was strangely, unnaturally quiet. As they set up camp on a small island that evening, the absence of normal wilderness sounds became glaringly obvious. There were no loons calling, no beavers slapping their tails, no evening bird songs. The silence was absolute and heavy, as if the entire ecosystem had been evacuated, as if every living thing had fled this place for reasons too terrible to contemplate. They hung their food in approved bear canisters, kept bear spray within arm's reach, and tried to ignore the creeping dread that was settling into their bones. Around 10 o'clock, as they settled into their tent, the silence was broken by a sound that made their blood run cold and their hearts stop for a moment. It was splashing in the water, but not the random, erratic splashing of fish or a swimming animal. This was rhythmic, powerful, and deliberate, like something massive swimming in a straight, unwavering line directly toward their island. The splashing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly at the shoreline. Chloe and Grace sat in paralyzed silence, listening. For 15 minutes, there was nothing. Then, the sound of movement began in the forest surrounding their camp. Whatever was out there was large enough to snap thick branches, yet it moved with an unnatural, predatory stealth. It was not wandering aimlessly. It was systematically circling their campsite, maintaining a consistent distance of about 30 feet, moving in a perfect, continuous loop around their tent. They remained frozen in their sleeping bags for over an hour, listening to the methodical pacing of an unseen predator. Whenever they mustered the courage to unzip the tent and shine a flashlight into the trees, the movement stopped instantly, leaving only the oppressive silence. The moment the light clicked off, the circling resumed. By dawn, they were exhausted, terrified, and desperate to leave. In the morning light, they inspected the perimeter of their camp and found the physical evidence of their nocturnal visitor. A clear, continuous trail had been trampled into the vegetation and soft earth, exactly 30 feet from the tent. The tracks were unlike anything either of them had ever seen. They were massive, far larger than a bear's paw or a moose's hoof. The impressions showed a foot structure that was disturbingly, almost human-like, but with elongated toes and deep, distinct claw marks gouged into the dirt. The stride length indicated an entity with incredibly long legs, and the depth of the prints suggested immense weight. Most chilling was the intelligence of the pattern. This was not random animal behavior. It was a deliberate, calculated surveillance. They broke camp in a frantic panic, loading the canoe with trembling hands and paddling away from the island as fast as their muscles allowed. Throughout the day, they felt the weight of unseen eyes on their backs. During a portage, Grace found more of the bizarre tracks leading from the water, up the trail, and back down to the water on the other side, confirming they were being actively followed. They pushed themselves to the point of exhaustion, paddling into the night to reach a lake near their exit point, making a cold, sleepless camp while taking turns standing watch. They made it to civilization the next morning, reporting the incident to park authorities. The rangers listened with grim seriousness, noting that there had been other, similar reports of unidentifiable tracks and large, unexplained wildlife activity in that exact sector. Chloe and Grace still canoe, but they avoid that region entirely, forever changed by the knowledge that the deep Canadian wilderness harbors entities that combine the raw power of an apex predator with a chilling, human-like intelligence. Our final tale takes us to the brutal, unforgiving winter landscapes of northwestern Montana, near Glacier National Park. Luke, an experienced winter outdoorsman and wildlife photographer, was accustomed to spending days alone in his heavily modified, four-wheel drive truck, braving sub-zero temperatures to capture images of wolves and mountain goats. In early January, he drove deep into a network of remote Forest Service roads, seeking isolated wildlife habitats. For the first 2 days, the trip was a success. But on Thursday afternoon, a predicted light snowfall rapidly escalated into a blinding, violent blizzard. Visibility dropped to zero, and the snow accumulated at a terrifying rate. Realizing the roads were becoming impassable, Luke made the prudent decision to pull over into a level area, activate his emergency satellite beacon, and wait out the storm. He was well supplied for 2 weeks and felt secure in his winterized vehicle. By the next morning, the storm had deposited over 2 feet of snow, completely burying the truck and sealing the roads. He reported his situation to emergency services, who assured him that road crews would reach him once the weather permitted, which could take several days. It was an inconvenient but manageable situation. That changed on the second night. Around midnight, Luke was awakened by the sound of human voices calling his name from outside the truck. The voices were distant but clear, echoing from different directions through the deep snow. They called Luke repeatedly, sometimes individually, sometimes overlapping in urgent, desperate tones. It was an impossible scenario. He was miles from civilization, trapped by a blizzard that had been raging for 2 days. No one could have reached him on foot in those conditions. He remained perfectly silent, listening. The voices continued for 20 minutes, sounding increasingly urgent, as if a search party was desperately trying to locate him. But something about the cadence was deeply wrong. The tone was too perfect, too consistent, lacking the natural breathlessness of people trudging through deep snow. It sounded like an imitation. After half an hour, the calling stopped. The following night, the voices returned, but this time, they were much closer, right outside the windows of his truck. They were no longer just calling his name. They were engaging in complex conversations designed to lure him out. They discussed his situation, expressed fake concern for his welfare, and mentioned specific details about his location that no one else should have known. Most horrifyingly, the voices began to perfectly imitate the people he loved most. He heard the distinct, unmistakable voices of his family members and close friends, pleading with him to come outside, claiming they had finally found him and needed his help to get him to safety. The imitations were flawless, capturing the exact pitch and emotional inflection of his loved ones. Throughout the third night, the psychological warfare intensified. The voices became aggressive and desperate, claiming there was a medical emergency, that someone was injured and bleeding in the snow, that search and rescue was right outside and just needed him to open the door. The urge to help, to respond, was a powerful, visceral pull. But a deep, primal instinct honed by years of wilderness survival, screamed at him to stay hidden. He remained silent, clutching his emergency beacon, staring out into the pitch-black, swirling snow. Occasionally, he heard the crunch of footsteps circling the truck, as if the entities were physically inspecting the vehicle. But when he looked, he saw nothing. On the fourth morning, the sound of actual machinery and human voices broke the spell. A search and rescue team had arrived with snowmobiles and a tracked vehicle, following his beacon. As they cleared the snow and prepared to escort him out, Luke described the terrifying voices he had endured for 3 nights. The rescue coordinator nodded grimly, mentioning that they occasionally received similar reports from stranded individuals, attributing it to isolation-induced auditory hallucinations. Luke might have accepted that explanation, clinging to the comfort of science, if not for one chilling detail the rescue team pointed out. As they examined the campsite, they showed Luke the snow around his truck. At distances ranging from 20 to 50 feet, there were distinct, well-defined boot prints. The tracks formed a perfect, systematic circle around his vehicle, indicating that someone or multiple people had spent hours standing in the freezing blizzard, silently observing his truck. The rescue team confirmed that no personnel had been in the area prior to their arrival that morning. The tracks belonged to unknown entities that had somehow traversed the impassable blizzard to stand outside his door, mimicking his loved ones, waiting for him to make a fatal mistake. Luke was evacuated safely, but he never returned to winter overlanding. He learned a terrifying lesson that cold, dark night. In the deepest, most isolated corners of the wilderness, survival sometimes depends on your ability to ignore the human voices calling to you from the darkness, because the things that mimic us are rarely, if ever, human. The wilderness is a mirror. It reflects our deepest fears, our greatest vulnerabilities, and the chilling reality that we are not the apex predators we believe ourselves to be. Whether it is the hidden, illicit operations in restricted national parks, the inexplicable, malevolent forces that stalk winter campsites, the terrifying, intelligent entities that circle remote islands, or the psychological horrors of isolation that mimic our loved ones, the message is clear. The woods are not empty. They are watching, they are waiting, and they do not care about your permits, your expensive gear, or your years of experience. Every step you take is observed. Every sound you make is noted. And when the trees go silent, when the voices call your name, when you feel a weight pressing against your tent, remember, you are not the hunter. You are the hunted. If these stories have sent a shiver down your spine, if they have made you look twice at the shadows in your own backyard, please remember to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with someone who appreciates the chilling reality of true wilderness horror. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an expedition into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, when you venture into the wild, you are a guest. And some hosts are far more dangerous than others.